The alien reconnaissance fleet moved in perfect silence through the cold darkness of an unclaimed star system, its ships gliding like shadows across a dead sky, their metallic hulls reflecting the faint light of a distant, dying star. Commander Jihan stood at the center of the flagship's control chamber, his sharp eyes fixed on the vast holographic display before him, while Officer Era monitored the sensor arrays with calm precision and Engineer Sora adjusted the scanning frequencies with careful hands. All of them experienced, disciplined, and confident in the superiority of their civilization. They had traveled through hundreds of systems, encountered countless species, and never once had they found anything that truly challenged their power. So when a single, unmoving object appeared near the orbit of a lifeless planet, it barely drew more than mild curiosity. The object was small compared to their fleet, shaped in a way that seemed inefficient and crude, its surface marked with lines and edges that did not follow the elegant symmetry of advanced design, and its energy readings were strangely low, almost as if it were inactive or abandoned. Jihan narrowed his eyes slightly, not in fear but in mild irritation, as if the object was wasting his time, and he gave a quiet command for a standard scan, expecting nothing more than confirmation that it was a relic or a drifting wreck. Era tilted her head as the first scan results appeared, her expression shifting ever so slightly, not into alarm but into confusion, because the readings did not match what she expected, and she calmly reported that the structure did not behave like normal matter. Sora leaned closer to her console, running the scan again, adjusting the spectrum, widening the parameters, and still the same strange results appeared, numbers that did not align, signals that overlapped in impossible ways, as if the object existed in more than one state at once. Jihan remained calm, though a faint line formed on his forehead, and he ordered a deeper scan, his voice steady, confident that any mystery could be solved with enough data, because that was how the galaxy worked, how it had always worked for them. The fleet repositioned slightly, surrounding the lone vessel at a safe distance, their systems focusing, their sensors extending like invisible threads reaching out to touch the unknown ship, and at first everything seemed normal, the data flowing in steady streams until suddenly the readings began to change. Era's hands paused above her console as the internal scan revealed something that made no sense at all, because the inside of the ship was larger than the outside, not by a small margin but by an impossible degree, as if space itself had been folded and compressed within its structure. She spoke quietly, repeating the data to make sure she was not mistaken, but the numbers did not change, and Sora confirmed it with a second scan, her voice slightly less steady than before. Jihan felt a small, unfamiliar feeling in his chest, not quite fear but something close to it, a sense that something was wrong in a way he could not yet understand, yet he refused to show it, maintaining his authority as he ordered them to continue. The scanning beams intensified, probing deeper into the ship's core, and what they found only made things worse, because the materials used in the ship's construction did not match any known element or alloy, their properties shifting depending on how they were observed, as if they were reacting to the scan itself. Era whispered that it was not possible, that matter could not behave like this, but the data kept coming, filling the screens with contradictions that refused to resolve. Then came the energy readings, and Sora froze for a moment before speaking, because the ship's power source was not just large, it was layered, like multiple reactors existing on top of each other, each one stronger than the last, yet all of them silent, dormant, waiting. Jihan took a slow breath, his confidence beginning to crack, though he still forced himself to remain calm, telling his crew that it was simply advanced technology, something they had not yet encountered, something that could still be understood and controlled. But even as he spoke, the sensors flickered, and a new signal appeared, one that had not been there before, a faint pulse coming from the human ship, steady and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Era stared at the signal, her eyes widening slightly as she realized that the ship was responding to the scan, not in a defensive way, not with weapons or shields, but with awareness, as if it knew exactly what they were doing. Sora tried to disconnect the deeper scan, her fingers moving quickly across the controls, but the system did not respond immediately, and for a brief moment, a silence filled the control room that felt heavier than any noise. Jihan's voice came out sharper now as he demanded a status update, and Era answered that the scan was still active, but something was interfering with it. Something inside the ship that was pushing back, not violently, but deliberately. The holographic display shifted again, showing new data that had not been requested, lines of unknown symbols forming across the screen, patterns that did not belong to their system, appearing as if the human ship was sending information directly into their network. Sora stepped back slightly, her calm expression finally breaking as she realized that this was not a passive object, not a dead vessel drifting in space, but something far more complex. Jihan felt that same strange feeling grow stronger, spreading through him like cold water, as he began to understand that they had made a mistake. Not a small one, but a serious one, the kind that could not easily be undone. Still, his pride held him in place, his belief in his fleet's superiority refusing to let him retreat, and he gave one final order to continue the scan at maximum depth. His voice firm even as doubt crept into his mind. The scanning beams surged forward, reaching into the deepest parts of the ship, and for a brief moment everything seemed still, as if the entire system was holding its breath, and then the readings changed again, not gradually but all at once, flooding the screens with data so dense and complex that it became impossible to read in real time. Era tried to filter it, to make sense of it, but the information did not behave like normal data, shifting and rearranging itself faster than their systems could process, while Sora attempted to shut down the scan completely, her hands moving faster now, urgency replacing precision. Jihan stood frozen, watching as the display filled with patterns that almost looked like they were alive, moving with a purpose that felt directed, intentional, and for the first time in his long career, he felt something he could not ignore, something that cut through his confidence and settled deep within him. The human warship, silent and still just moments ago, was no longer just an object in space, and as the alien fleet continued their scan, they began to realize, slowly and unwillingly, that they were not the ones in control of this encounter, and that whatever they had chosen to observe was now fully aware of them, watching them in return with a patience that felt far more dangerous than any immediate attack. The alien fleet did not move away, even though a quiet tension had begun to spread through every ship, because Commander Jihan still believed that knowledge would give them control, and control would remove the unease that had settled in his chest. So he stood firm at the center of the control chamber while Era and Sora continued their work with growing caution, their earlier confidence now replaced by careful focus as they tried to understand the strange human warship that floated before them, like a silent question with no clear answer. The scanning systems were pushed further than standard limits, drawing energy from secondary reserves, and the beams that reached toward the ship became sharper and more precise, cutting through layers of unknown material. Yet each new layer only revealed deeper confusion, because the structure of the ship refused to stay consistent. Corridors appeared where none had existed seconds before, vast empty spaces unfolded inside tight compartments, and readings overlapped in ways that made it seem like multiple ships were existing in the same place at once. Era spoke quietly as she described the data, her voice controlled but slower than before, explaining that the internal layout was shifting, not physically in a violent way but smoothly, almost naturally, like a living system adjusting itself in response to observation. And Sora confirmed this with a second set of scans, her hands moving carefully as she tried to lock the structure into a stable map, but every attempt failed as the ship's interior continued to rearrange beyond their understanding. Jihan listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the display, and although he did not speak his thoughts, he was beginning to feel that they were not studying a machine in the normal sense, because machines followed rules, even advanced ones, but this vessel behaved as if rules were optional, as if it chose when to follow them and when to ignore them. The sensor feed suddenly flickered again, and a deeper layer of the scan activated automatically, revealing energy signatures that had been hidden before, not because they were weak but because they had been concealed, and when they appeared, the entire control room fell silent for a moment, because the readings were far beyond anything the alien fleet had ever recorded, showing power levels that could not be sustained by any known reactor design. Sora stared at the data, her breathing slowing as she tried to remain calm, and she reported that the ship contained multiple energy cores, each one different in nature, some producing measurable output while others existed in states that could not be clearly defined, as if they were both active and inactive at the same time. Era added that the energy patterns did not behave like normal output but resembled something closer to biological rhythms, rising and falling in slow, deliberate cycles, and that observation made a quiet chill pass through the room, because it suggested that the ship was not simply powered, it was functioning in a way that felt almost alive. Jihan finally spoke, his voice steady but lower than before, ordering them to isolate the energy sources and identify their purpose, because he still needed a clear answer, something solid that could be understood and controlled. Yet even as the command was given, the system hesitated, and a brief delay appeared on the interface as if something was resisting their request. Sora noticed it immediately and tried to override the delay, her fingers moving faster now, but the system responded with an unfamiliar signal, not an error, not a warning, but a soft pulse that spread across the console like a ripple. Era's eyes widened slightly as new data began to fill the screen, data that they had not requested, showing fragments of internal systems within the human warship, but these fragments were incomplete, shifting, almost as if the ship was choosing what to reveal and what to hide. Jihan felt the unease grow stronger, but he forced himself to stay focused, telling himself that this was still a scan, still a process under their control, even though the evidence was beginning to say otherwise. The fleet outside remained in position, their weapons idle but ready, their engines humming softly as they maintained formation around the lone vessel, yet small irregularities began to appear across their systems, minor fluctuations at first, small enough to ignore, but consistent enough to notice. Era reported that several ships were experiencing brief sensor delays, nothing critical, but unusual given the stability of their technology, and Sora added that power distribution in the flagship had shifted slightly without command input, as if the system had adjusted itself for reasons it could not explain. Jihan's expression tightened and he ordered a diagnostic check, but even as the command was issued, he knew that the problem was not internal because the timing was too precise, too closely linked to the deep scan they were performing on the human warship. The holographic display changed again, zooming into the core of the ship, where the most intense readings were coming from, and for a brief moment, the structure appeared stable, allowing Era to map a central chamber unlike anything they had seen before, a vast space contained within a small physical boundary, filled with shifting light and energy patterns that moved in complex, layered motions. Sora tried to analyze the patterns, but the data did not translate into any known form, and every attempt to categorize it resulted in contradictions, as if the system itself refused to be understood in simple terms. Jihan stepped closer to the display, his eyes narrowing as he studied the movement of the patterns, and for a brief moment, he felt something strange, a sense that the patterns were not random, that they were forming shapes, almost like symbols, though they shifted too quickly to be fully recognized. Era noticed it as well and quietly suggested that the patterns might be a form of communication, but before she could continue, the entire system pulsed again, stronger this time, and the scan output surged beyond normal limits, flooding the display with data that moved faster than their processors could handle. Sora reacted immediately, attempting to shut down the deep scan, her voice now carrying clear urgency as she reported that the system was no longer responding properly. But her commands were delayed, intercepted by something that seemed to be interacting directly with their controls. Jihan felt the last of his confidence begin to break, replaced by a growing realization that they had crossed a boundary they did not understand. Yet he still refused to panic, forcing himself to remain composed as he ordered all ships to prepare for possible disengagement. Outside, the fleet began to adjust, engines warming, formations shifting slightly, but even this movement felt slower than it should have been, as if the entire system was being held in place by an unseen force. Era suddenly spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost uncertain, as she reported that the human warship was no longer just responding to the scan, it was interacting with it, sending structured signals back through the scanning beams, signals that were being interpreted by their systems as valid data even though they had not been requested. Sora confirmed it, her hands still moving as she tried to isolate the connection, but the signals continued to flow, steady and controlled, as if the ship had complete awareness of their technology and was using it with ease. Jihan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in fear but in thought, and when he opened them again, there was a new understanding in his gaze, a quiet realization that the situation was no longer what it had seemed at the start, because they were not simply scanning a human warship anymore, and as the data continued to pour in, as their systems responded in ways they could not fully control, it became increasingly clear that the line between observer and subject had begun to blur, and that whatever intelligence existed within that silent vessel was no longer passive, no longer distant, but actively present, watching, learning, and perhaps already deciding what to do next. The moment the deep scan reached what Era believed to be the core of the human warship, everything in the alien fleet changed in a way that none of them had ever experienced before, because the data did not just increase, it transformed, shifting from raw numbers into structured information that seemed to carry meaning on its own, and Commander Jihan stood still as the holographic display filled with layered streams of symbols that rearranged themselves faster than thought, while Era and Sora struggled to keep up. their training and discipline pushed to their limits as they tried to understand what they were seeing. The central chamber of the ship, which had once appeared as a vast and silent space, now revealed deeper levels hidden within it, like doors opening one after another without end, each layer exposing new systems that did not resemble weapons in any traditional sense, yet carried a sense of overwhelming power that could not be ignored, and Era's voice, though still controlled, carried a quiet tension as she explained that the ship's core was not a single structure but a network of interconnected systems that extended beyond physical space, as if the ship existed partly outside the dimension they occupied. Sora confirmed this with a second analysis, her hands trembling slightly as she reported that the energy signatures were no longer stable, not because they were failing but because they were expanding, reaching into frequencies that their instruments could barely detect, and Jihan felt a cold realization settle over him. Because this was no longer a matter of advanced technology, it was something entirely different, something that did not follow the same rules that had governed every other encounter they had ever faced. The data stream suddenly focused into a series of organized patterns, and for the first time, the alien systems began to translate fragments of the information automatically, not because they had decoded it but because the data itself was adapting to be understood, and what appeared on the screen made Era's breath catch for a moment, because it was not just technical information, it was records detailed and precise, showing images and logs of distant star systems, fleets far larger than their own, and events that carried a clear and terrible meaning. Jihan stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the display as the images shifted, showing civilizations that rose and fell in moments, entire planets going dark under forces that could not be clearly seen, and ships that looked nothing like the one before them yet carried the same underlying design, the same impossible structure, and Sora whispered that these were not simulations, not theoretical data, but actual records of past events stored within the ship. Era nodded slowly, her voice quieter now as she added that the timestamps did not match any known galactic history, extending far beyond their recorded timeline, suggesting that the ship was far older than it appeared, possibly ancient, possibly still active across a scale they could not comprehend. Jihan felt the weight of that realization press against him, because it meant that the human warship was not just advanced, it was part of something larger, something that had been operating long before their civilization had reached the stars, and yet it bore the mark of humanity, a species they had believed to be young and limited. The data shifted again, focusing now on a specific sequence of logs, and as the translation improved, words began to form, simple at first, then clearer, as if the system was choosing language that they could understand, and the message that appeared was short but heavy with meaning, describing a series of encounters labeled as threats, each one followed by a response that ended in total silence from the opposing side. Sora's hands froze above her console as she realized what that meant, and Era closed her eyes briefly before speaking, her voice steady but low, explaining that the ship was not just recording history, it was documenting actions, decisions, outcomes, and that every outcome shown in the logs ended the same way, with the complete disappearance of the threat. Jihan did not respond immediately because he was still looking at the images, still processing the scale of what they were seeing, and for the first time, he allowed himself to accept the truth that had been forming since the scan began, that this ship was not a relic, not a drifting object waiting to be claimed, but a functioning system designed for a purpose far more serious than they had imagined. The realization spread through the control room, unspoken but understood, as the crew began to see the pattern in the data, the consistent structure of detection, observation, evaluation, and response, repeated across countless entries, each one precise, efficient, and final. Era spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper as she pointed out a specific detail, that the current scan they were performing had been added to the log, recorded in real time as a new entry, and that single detail caused a ripple of fear to pass through the room, because it meant that they were not just observers of this system, they were now part of it. Sora immediately tried to terminate the scan completely, her hands moving with urgency, but the system did not respond. The commands delayed or redirected as if something else had taken priority, and Jihan felt a sharp tension in his chest as he realized that they were no longer in control of their own technology. The display changed once more, clearing the flood of data and focusing on a single line of text that appeared slowly, each symbol forming with deliberate precision, and as the translation completed, the message became clear and simple, direct language that left no room for misunderstanding. Threat detected. Observation complete. Response pending. The words hung in the air, silent yet overwhelming, And for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because the meaning was too clear to ignore. Era's hands trembled slightly as she looked at Jihan, waiting for an order, any order that could restore a sense of control, while Sora stared at her console, searching for any way to break the connection. But the systems remained locked in place, responding to something beyond their commands. Jihan finally took a slow breath, his voice quieter than before but still carrying authority as he ordered all ships to prepare for immediate retreat, because the situation had changed in a way that could not be managed through analysis alone. Yet even as the command was issued, a part of him knew that it might already be too late. Outside, the fleet began to shift, engines activating, formations breaking as ships prepared to leave the system. But the human warship remained still, silent, unchanged in its position, and that stillness felt heavier now, filled with a sense of control that did not need to be shown through movement. Era watched the sensors closely, her heart beating faster as she reported that the ship's energy levels were rising. Not rapidly, not violently, but steadily, as if something within it was waking up, and Sora added that the surrounding space itself was beginning to distort slightly, small fluctuations appearing in the fabric of reality that their instruments struggled to measure. Jihan stood firm, though the fear he had resisted for so long was now fully present, clear and undeniable, because he understood at last that the greatest mistake they had made was not underestimating the human warship, but believing that they had ever been in a position to study it without consequence. And as the final preparations for retreat continued, the silent ship before them remained exactly where it had always been, watching, recording, and now, perhaps, ready to act. The shift began so quietly that for a brief moment no one in the alien fleet understood that anything had changed at all, because the human warship did not fire a weapon or make a sudden move. It simply existed in a new state, and Commander Jihan felt it before he saw it. A subtle pressure that seemed to settle over the control room as if space itself had grown heavier, while Era and Sora stared at their consoles as the data streams stabilized into something far more ordered and far more dangerous than before. The message that had appeared moments earlier did not disappear, it remained fixed on the display, response pending. And as the fleet initiated retreat procedures, the systems began to resist in ways that were no longer small or uncertain, because engines that should have ignited instantly hesitated, power lines rerouted without command, and navigation systems displayed paths that led nowhere, looping back on themselves like a maze with no exit. Jihan spoke quickly, his voice firm despite the growing tension, ordering manual overrides across all ships, and Era transmitted the command through the fleet, but even that action felt delayed, as if their own signals had to pass through something unseen before reaching their destination. Sora worked rapidly, her hands moving with precision as she tried to isolate the interference, but every system she accessed showed the same pattern. A quiet but complete control that did not belong to them, and she reported that the human warship was no longer interacting with their scan alone. It had extended into their entire network, touching every connected system with calm and deliberate precision. Outside, the fleet began to drift slightly out of formation, not because the pilots had lost control, but because the ships themselves no longer responded exactly as expected, their thrusters firing at reduced output, their alignment shifting by small but critical degrees, and Era watched in growing alarm as each vessel reported similar issues, none catastrophic on their own, but together forming a clear and terrifying pattern. Jihan stepped closer to the main display, his eyes fixed on the human warship, which remained completely still against the dark background of space. Its surface unchanged, its lights dim, showing no sign of effort or urgency, and that stillness carried a meaning that was impossible to ignore, because it suggested that whatever was happening did not require visible action, that the ship's true capabilities existed beyond simple movement or force. The sensor arrays suddenly updated again, and Era's voice grew tense as she described the changes, explaining that the energy fields around the human warship were expanding, not in a wave or a blast, but in a controlled, layered pattern that spread outward like a slow ripple through space, and as it touched the outer edges of the alien fleet, the distortions became stronger. Sora confirmed it with her own readings, noting that local space was bending in subtle ways, distances shifting by fractions that made navigation unreliable, and time measurements fluctuating just enough to disrupt synchronization between ships. Jihan realized then that escape was no longer a simple matter of distance or speed, because the very space they relied on to move was being altered, shaped by a force they could not counter. The first major failure came from one of the outer ships, where the crew reported that their weapons system had activated without command, targeting empty space before shutting down completely, and moments later another ship lost all propulsion, drifting slowly despite full power input. And Era relayed each report with increasing urgency, her calm voice now carrying a clear edge of fear. Jihan issued new orders, telling all ships to shut down non-essential systems and focus entirely on propulsion, hoping to break free from the growing field of influence. But the response across the fleet was inconsistent, some ships complying, others failing to execute the command fully, as if their systems were being rewritten in real time. Sora suddenly stepped back from her console, her expression shaken as she realized what was happening, and she explained that the human warship was not just interfering with their technology, it was understanding it, learning its structure and behavior, and then using that knowledge to control it with perfect accuracy. Era looked at her in disbelief for a moment, but the evidence was already clear on the screens, showing patterns of access and control that moved faster than any organic or artificial intelligence they had encountered before. Jihan felt the last trace of his earlier confidence disappear, replaced by a sharp and focused awareness that they were completely exposed. Their strengths turned into weaknesses by something that understood them better than they understood themselves. The human warship finally showed its first visible change, not in the form of movement but in light, as faint lines across its surface began to glow softly, not bright enough to be threatening, but steady and deliberate, like a signal that could not be ignored. Era reported that the ship's energy output had increased again, though still far below its maximum potential, and Sora added that the distortions in space were becoming more precise, targeting individual ships rather than the fleet as a whole. One by one, the alien vessels began to lose functionality, their systems shutting down or behaving in ways that made coordinated action impossible, and the sense of control that the fleet had once held was now completely gone. Jihan watched as the situation unfolded, his mind racing for a solution, but every option depended on systems that were no longer reliable, and every second that passed seemed to tighten the invisible hold around them. Era suddenly spoke again, her voice quieter now but filled with realization, as she pointed out a pattern in the disruptions, noting that the human warship was not attacking randomly, it was demonstrating control, showing exactly how much power it had without using more than necessary, and that understanding brought a deeper fear than any direct attack could have. Sora nodded slowly, adding that the ship was holding back, limiting its actions to precise, controlled interference rather than destruction, and that meant it had a purpose beyond simply eliminating them. Jihan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a new clarity, because he understood now that this was not a battle, not even a conflict in the usual sense. It was a demonstration, a message delivered through action rather than words. The fleet's communications suddenly filled with static, broken fragments of sound that did not match any known language, yet carried a strange rhythm, almost like overlapping voices speaking at once, and Era struggled to filter the signal, her hands moving quickly as she tried to isolate a clear channel. But the interference continued, surrounding them from all directions. Outside, the human warship remained motionless, its glowing lines steady, its presence dominating the space around it without effort, and the alien fleet, once proud and powerful, was now reduced to a scattered group of drifting vessels, each one held in place by forces they could neither see nor resist. Jihan stood in silence, his posture still strong even as the situation collapsed around him, and for the first time since the encounter began, he did not give an immediate order, because there was nothing left to command that could change what was happening. Era looked at him, waiting while Sora continued to work, refusing to stop even when the systems ignored her, and in that moment the realization became complete, clear and undeniable, that they had never been the ones in control, not at the start, not during the scan, and certainly not now. The human warship had allowed them to approach, allowed them to observe, and now it was allowing them to understand, not through explanation, but through experience, showing them exactly how powerless they were against something that operated on a level far beyond their reach. And as the distortions in space settled into a stable hold, as the fleet's systems fell quiet one by one, the final truth settled over them like a shadow, that they had not been studying the human warship at all, but had been studied in return, measured, evaluated, and now held in a state where resistance was no longer possible, waiting for whatever decision would come next. The silence that followed felt heavier than any battle, because no weapons had been fired and yet the alien fleet was completely defeated. not through destruction but through control so precise and absolute that it left no room for resistance, and Commander Jihan stood still in the center of the control chamber, his eyes fixed on the motionless human warship as if trying to understand something that could not be explained with logic alone. Around him, Era and Sora remained at their stations, their hands resting on consoles that no longer responded fully to their commands, their earlier urgency replaced by a quiet, careful stillness, as if any sudden action might trigger something worse, though deep down they already knew that the situation was no longer theirs to influence. Outside, the fleet drifted in scattered positions, ships held in place by invisible forces, their engines silent or running without effect, their weapon systems inactive, and their communications reduced to low static that carried faint traces of signals they could not decode. The human warship remained exactly where it had been from the beginning, its surface dim except for the soft glow of lines that now pulsed slowly, like a calm and steady heartbeat, and that quiet rhythm filled the space around it with a sense of control that did not need to be shown through movement or force. Jihan finally spoke, his voice low but steady, asking Era for a full status report, not because he expected a solution, but because he needed to understand what remained of their situation, and Era responded carefully, explaining that all ships were still intact, that no structural damage had been detected, but that nearly every system was either restricted or operating under unknown interference, as if their entire fleet had been placed under observation and control without suffering direct harm. Sora added that the distortions in space had stabilized, no longer expanding or changing, but holding the fleet in a fixed region that could not be escaped through normal means, and she hesitated for a moment before adding that the human warship's energy output had leveled off, suggesting that whatever process it had been executing was now complete. Jihan listened in silence, absorbing each detail, and for the first time since the encounter began, he allowed himself to fully accept the truth that had been building from the moment they initiated the scan, that they had not faced an enemy in the traditional sense, but something far more controlled, far more deliberate, something that did not act out of anger or urgency, but out of purpose. The control room lights flickered softly as a new signal appeared on the main display, cutting through the static with perfect clarity, and both Era and Sora turned toward it at the same time, their expressions tense but focused as they watched the signal stabilize into a structured transmission. Jihan stepped closer, his posture straight, his attention fully fixed on the screen as the signal began to translate automatically, the symbols forming into simple, clear words that carried a weight far greater than their size, and when the message completed, the room fell completely silent. Humanity does not seek war, but we do not fear it. Remember what you have seen. The words remained on the display, steady and unchanging, and for a long moment no one spoke, because the meaning was clear without the need for explanation. A statement not of threat, but of certainty, delivered with a calm that made it far more powerful than any display of force. Era's voice broke the silence softly as she confirmed that the signal had been received across the entire fleet, every ship now displaying the same message, and Sora added that the interference in their systems was beginning to fade, not suddenly, but gradually, as if the control that had held them was being released step by step. Jihan watched as the systems responded, engines regaining proper function, navigation stabilizing, communications clearing, and yet none of it felt like a victory because the reason for their release was not something they had achieved, but something that had been granted. Outside, the distortions in space began to dissolve, the invisible hold loosening until the ships could move freely once again, and one by one, the fleet regained control, their formations slowly re-establishing as pilots tested their systems with careful movements. Era reported that all ships were operational, though still shaken, and Sora confirmed that no lasting damage had been detected, but both of them understood that what had been lost was not something that could be repaired through technical means, because the confidence that had defined their mission was now gone, replaced by a deep and lasting awareness of something far beyond their reach. Jihan took a slow breath, then gave a quiet order for the fleet to withdraw from the system immediately, his voice calm but firm, and this time the command was executed without resistance, the ships turning away from the human warship and accelerating toward open space, leaving behind the silent vessel that had changed everything without firing a single shot. As the distance grew, the human warship remained in place, its glowing lines fading slowly until it returned to the same dim, inactive appearance it had shown at the beginning, as if nothing had happened at all, as if it had simply been waiting, observing, and had now returned to that state once more. The fleet moved in silence, no one speaking more than necessary, Each crew member lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what they had experienced, and Era stood quietly at her station, her eyes fixed on the fading signal of the human ship, while Sora reviewed the system logs again and again, searching for answers she knew she might never find. Jihan remained at the center of the control room, his expression calm but changed, the arrogance that had once defined him replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful, and as he looked at the final data from the encounter, he understood that the message they had received was not meant only for them, but for anyone who might one day make the same mistake. In the cycles that followed, the story of the encounter spread across their civilization, carried through official reports and whispered conversations, told again and again with careful detail, because it was not just a record of an event, but a warning that could not be ignored, and the image of the silent human warship became something more than a memory. It became a symbol of a force that existed beyond pride, beyond fear, a force that chose restraint not out of weakness, but out of control. Far away, in the quiet darkness of that same system, the human warship remained alone once more, drifting near the dead planet as it had before. Its systems calm, its presence silent, yet deep within its structure, processes continued, records updated, observations stored, and a quiet awareness remained, watching the vast expanse of space with patience that did not fade, ready to respond again if necessary, but content to wait, because it did not need to seek out conflict, it only needed to be there, unseen, until something chose to look too closely again.